if I want to welcome you in Poland, and in Szczecin. I've heard that it's your first time here. What did you heard about Poland? I know that in some books of yours you have examples with Polish during Second World War II.
Well, I actually, before coming here, knew very little about contemporary Poland, but I know just a little bit about Polish history, and in particular the terrible suffering of the Polish people at the hands of both the Nazis and the Soviet Union in World War II. And I use the example of the Soviet-German invasion of Poland because it's really the beginning of World War II. It's really the most obvious example that I can think of completely unprovoked wrongful aggression. So that's why I use it.
Tell the story of your experience with the ethics in general and with the ethics of killing and ethics of war begun.
Well, I think it began when I was a teenager, because I grew up in the United States during the time of the Vietnam War, and there was a possibility that I might be drafted into the army and sent to fight. And so all young people, when I was in high school, especially those a little bit older than I was, had to think about war, because we were all threatened with perhaps having to go fight in a war that many of us didn't understand and thought was probably unjust. So I was interested in the Vietnam War, what was going on, and then when I went off to university, my introduction to philosophy was really through Bertrand Russell. I was not a philosophy major. I didn't take my degree in philosophy. I took my degree in literature, but I read some Bertrand Russell, who was, to me, a popular philosopher, and I read his popular books. And he wrote some books about the threat of nuclear weapons, and I read those and was very impressed with those. Then, when I went to study in England, I was there for some years, and I was bored with a lot of the philosophy that I had to do when I was starting to do philosophy. But the writers whose work were most interesting to me were Peter Singer and Jonathan Glover. They're the ones who really helped me to understand that practical ethics is what I wanted to work on. And I was very influenced by Jonathan Glover's book, Causing Death and Saving Lives. And part of that book is about war, and it's all about killing and letting die. And I think my interests had always been in practical ethical issues, but reading Jonathan's book made me certain that that's what I wanted to do. Shortly after I read Jonathan's book and began working on some of the problems that he was working on, like abortion, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and then Reagan became president and proposed to put lots of nuclear missiles both in Britain and in Western Europe, and so the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union became very much more tense and threatening. And during that period, I joined the anti-nuclear movement in Britain and in Europe, and I wrote on nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, and that involved me in reading about just war theory, and I went on from there. So the many different sources converging to create my interest in these issues. Much longer answer than you anticipated.
It's really good. I expected, so I'm happy. So you said about the Vietnam War in this time and even now. What do you think about pacifism? Did you try to be a pacifist?
No, I've never been a pacifist. I think pacifism is a false doctrine. There are two kinds of pacifism. There's absolute pacifism, which is, I think, the more common kind in the history of thinking about war, which says that the resort to war is never permissible, and it's never permissible to participate in war, and this is an absolute prohibition. I think myself that view is not just implausible, but possibly incoherent. It just doesn't. I just don't think you can state the doctrine in a way that doesn't show that it's arbitrary, because it has to draw a line somewhere. If it draws a line between war and forms of conflict that are less than war, then it draws a line somewhere that's going to be quite arbitrary. And the same thing is true if it appeals to an absolute prohibition against killing, and there are things that we can do to people that are arguably even worse than killing them, and those have to be absolutely prohibited as well. So I don't accept that. I think that there are some interesting and respectable and plausible arguments for what's called contingent pacifism, which is the idea that in the world as it is, there just can't be any just war, so in principle there could be. But I think that's mistaken as well, and I have some writings that try to give the arguments to show that contingent pacifism is false. Actually, one of those articles published in a published journal, Diametros, or?
Diametros, yes. So, we are at the International Conference Ethics of Killing. For some people, those words like ethics and killing are contradictions when you're putting those words together. What do you think about this?
I think that that's a mistake. I think most people, if they think about it, recognize that there are some forms of killing that are permissible. Everybody thinks it's permissible to kill plants, and most people think it's permissible to kill animals in certain conditions, and most people also think it's permissible in some conditions to kill other human beings. Most people believe that it can be permissible to kill in self-defense, or that it can be permissible to kill in war. Some people believe that abortion is permissible, or that euthanasia is permissible. So the challenge is to understand which instances of killing are actually permissible and which are impermissible, and that's an ethical issue. So it seems to me one of the most important ethical issues.
What about vegetarianism? I heard and I know that you are a vegetarian. Why?
I'm a vegetarian because I think that there are no good reasons to justify people who live in comfortable, affluent conditions like ourselves in developed Western countries to cause suffering to animals and deprive animals of their lives in order to be able to eat them. It's not clear to me that I think that animals necessarily have rights or are appropriate objects of Kantian respect or whatever, but they do have interests, and those interests are important, and if we're going to violate those interests or frustrate those interests, we have to have some good justification for it. At the very least, we have to show that the benefits to ourselves are greater than the harms that we inflict. And possibly it would have to be a condition of justification that the benefits that we would get from inflicting these harms would have to be significantly greater than the harms that we inflict. But I think that the harms we inflict are vastly greater than any benefits that we get. And so I think that eating meat is just unjustified. I think it's an appalling practice. I don't know if any arguments that I find are even remotely plausible for the practice. I think it's just overwhelmingly obvious that meat eating is wrong. It's one of the things where I think all the arguments are on one side, and there are just no good arguments on the other. There's just self-interest and obtuseness on the other side. And most people think it's permissible, but I predict that if we continue to be progressively morally enlightened, and after a certain number of years, human beings will look back at the way we treat animals today with the kind of horror that we experience when we look back and see that human beings had slaves and that sort of thing.
Okay. Back to the war subject and violence issue. What do you think? Why people fighting with each other? Hardin said that it is contradiction to think that it is in our nature to fighting with each other, to make a war between the nations. But some people think that we have something like a bug of killing inside. What do you think about that? Is it our human nature or not?
Well, in a way there's an obvious answer to that, and that is that we do it all the time, and nobody makes us do it. Therefore it must be our nature. It's not that we're acting unnaturally when we engage in war, we're doing something that people have always done. So yes, I think it's an obvious answer that it's in our nature.
But Howard Zinn said that...
Who is it?
Howard Zinn.
Oh, Howard Zinn.
Howard Zinn, yeah.
Okay.
Said something like that probably when some war is during during war is some kind of propaganda for the nations. So that means that therefore without propaganda some people wouldn't even